Shabai's story is one that just, it really gets you thinking. She makes this decision to end her life, and it's all documented with this, like, really calm, peaceful presence, and it sparked this whole debate online.
Yeah, it reeled up.
She was a successful entrepreneur in Shanghai, spoke all these languages, traveled the world, seemed like she had it all, really. But at 20, she gets diagnosed with lupus, and it really, like, shaped all her choices.
It did.
So was her decision brave, or was it irresponsible?
I mean, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a tough one. And that's why we're doing this deep dive today, to look at all the different sides of this.
Yeah, it is complex. Shabai's life was vibrant, full of all these experiences. But ultimately, she makes the choice to end it.
Yeah.
So to really understand why, we need to go back to that lupus diagnosis and how she responded to it, because it was unique. She rejected those standard high-dose steroid treatments.
And that's so interesting right off the bat.
It is.
Most people would just follow their doctor's advice, especially with something as serious as lupus. Why do you think she chose a different route?
Well, Shabai was very open about wanting to live a shorter life, but, like, to the fullest. Rather than deal with the side effects of all the medication and the limitations that lupus put on her, she wanted to control how she lived her life. And that included controlling how she looked.
Okay.
She felt the steroids would change her appearance. And that was something she wasn't willing to accept.
It sounds like she was fiercely independent.
Absolutely. And that independent spirit is reflected in everything she did.
Yeah.
She traveled, she worked, she pushed her physical limits, all while managing a chronic illness. I mean, it's pretty remarkable.
Until her condition gets worse, right? And that's when she needed dialysis, and her quality of life takes this major hit. And this is where that search for a kidney donor gets really, really complicated.
Yeah, it does. And this is the part of the story that generated so much discussion online. Shabai was very public about her search. And it raises so many ethical questions, especially when you look at the organ donation system in China.
Okay, so can we, like, break that down a bit? Because I don't think most of our listeners are familiar with how organ donation works in China and how it's different from other places.
Sure. So in China, organ donation from living donors is only allowed between relatives.
Oh, wow.
Which is very different from many Western countries where anyone can choose to be a living donor.
Right.
So Shabai saw this system as inherently unfair, potentially allowing wealthier people to exploit the situation.
Okay.
In fact, she even documented a case where her caregiver offered her a kidney, but she declined because she believed that offer might be motivated by money.
Wow. So even in a life or death situation, she was still very aware of that potential for exploitation.
Exactly. And her experience trying to find a kidney donor in China really highlights those ethical complexities surrounding organ donation, not just in China, but globally. It makes you think about donor compensation, access to healthcare, and that potential for coercion, especially in countries with less regulated systems.
Right. And then there's the situation with her cousin.
Yes. So Shabai reaches out to her cousin to ask for a kidney donation, and she's refused. And what follows is this very public expression of her feeling owed an apology from her cousin.
Oh, wow.
Which sparked a lot of backlash online. Many people felt like she was putting this unfair burden and expectation on her family.
Yeah, it seems like her strong sense of, like, personal autonomy might have clashed with those traditional family expectations, especially in Chinese culture.
It's a really good point. And it leads us to her ultimate decision, assisted suicide in Switzerland.
Yeah, and this is where things get really heavy.
Yeah, it's a big decision for sure. And before we even go into why I think it's important to understand what assisted suicide even means.
Yeah, because there's a lot of confusion around that term. People kind of use it interchangeably with euthanasia, but they're not really the same thing, right?
No, they're not.
Yeah.
So euthanasia is where a doctor directly administers that lethal dose to end a patient's life. Assisted suicide is where the person actually takes their own life, but a physician provides them the means to do it. Okay. And Switzerland has very specific laws around assisted suicide. It's legal there, but under very strict conditions, the person has to be of sound mind. And it has to be completely voluntary. And the person assisting can't benefit in any way.
So it's not like a casual decision at all.
No, not at all. There's a lot of assessments and evaluations involved.
Yeah.
And it's important to know that this is very different from the laws around euthanasia globally, which are much more limited.
Okay. So what about Shabai's reasons for choosing this path? She laid out her rationale pretty clearly in those videos.
She did. Yeah.
Yeah.
She really emphasized her belief in individual autonomy.
Yeah.
So that right to make decisions about her own life and her own death. And she felt that she had lived a full and meaningful life, and she didn't want to endure more suffering from her illness and, the really demanding dialysis regimen. And she also talked about not wanting to burden her aging father with her care.
Yeah, and that final trip to Switzerland with her father is just incredibly moving. They're touring these beautiful landscapes, but There's this underlying current of sadness and just this weight of these difficult decisions.
Yeah. She even mentioned that she wouldn't have even continued dialysis if it wasn't for her father being there.
It really shows you how complex their relationship was.
Mm.
You see his sadness. You see her determination. And that really poignant goodbye where she acknowledges the burden that she's placing on him.
And this brings up something that I've been thinking about a lot. On the one hand, you have Shabai advocating for her own needs and her desires, even saying at one point that she doesn't owe her parents anything. And she even blamed her mother for hurtling. It almost seems kind of self-centered.
That's a good point. But it's really important to consider the cultural context here.
Yeah.
So filial piety, which is very ingrained in Chinese culture, emphasizes respect and obedience towards parents and elders.
Okay.
So Shabai's defiance of those strong cultural norms, I think it really adds another layer to understanding her actions and her statements.
So are we just supposed to accept her statements at face value? I mean, how do we reconcile that with, this image of a loving daughter?
Well, it's not really about accepting or rejecting, but more about trying to understand. Think about the potential psychological impact of, her long battle with lupus.
Yeah.
The pain, the limitations it put on her life, the constant awareness of her own mortality.
Right.
That can really shape a person's outlook.
Yeah.
It doesn't excuse her words, but it can help us understand where they might be coming from.
That's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to remember that everyone processes things differently, especially trauma and chronic illness. But even considering all of those factors, her decision sparked this massive debate online. People had very strong opinions on both sides.
Yeah, they did. Absolutely. Some people were really championing her right to choose, seeing it as this brave act of self-determination. Others condemned it as selfish and irresponsible, saying that it disregarded her obligations to her family and to society.
It's almost like this fundamental question of individual autonomy versus societal expectations.
Right.
Where do we draw that line? How do we balance personal freedom with the responsibility that we have to other people, especially when it comes to life and death?
I mean, it's a question that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries. And to try to navigate this whole moral maze, we can look to the work of John Stuart Mill and his harm principle.
Okay, break down that harm principle for us.
Okay, so basically the harm principle suggests that individuals should have the freedom to do whatever they want as long as their actions don't harm others.
Okay.
And Shabai's supporters would argue that her choice, while undeniably painful for her loved ones, didn't directly infringe on anyone else's rights.
But it's not that simple, is it? Surely our actions always have some kind of ripple effect on the people around us.
You're absolutely right. It's not always so clear-cut, and that's where those opposing views come in. So the legal scholar Louis Xiang, drawing upon Kantian philosophy, critiques Shabai's logic.
Okay, so this is getting a little philosophical. Can you give us the ELI 5 version?
Okay, so Kant basically emphasized duty and responsibility, arguing that we shouldn't treat ourselves as just means to an end. So Lewis suggests that Shabai's focus on her own personal happiness without fully considering her obligations to her family and to society kind of clashes with this principle.
Okay.
He believes that we have a duty to consider how our choices will impact others, even in those end-of-life decisions.
It's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder if there even is a right or wrong answer here.
Maybe there isn't. Shabai's story, it's not really about finding the right or wrong answers, but more about prompting us to examine our own values and beliefs.
Yeah, and even my tweet urging Shabai to, delay her decision and engage in more dialogue sparked controversy. Some people accused me of trying to, obstruct her autonomy.
Do you remember that? Yeah.
But it was never my intention to deny her agency. As a journalist, I was just driven by this desire to understand her perspective more deeply and maybe even encourage her to reconsider. But this whole situation has been a real reminder of how crucial respectful discourse is when we're dealing with such sensitive issues. Assisted suicide really touches on those deeply held beliefs about life and death and our responsibilities to ourselves and to others.
And that's exactly why it's such an important conversation to have, because Shabai's story isn't just about her individual choice.
Right.
It forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our own values.
Yeah.
Our relationship with mortality and how we as a society approach end-of-life care.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in all the ethics and the legal stuff, But at the end of the day, this is a human story. She was dealing with this awful disease, and she made choices that a lot of people just don't get.
And that's where empathy comes in, right? Trying to see it from her side. Recognizing how much lupus took from her physically, emotionally. And understanding how her background, her culture might have shaped her views about family and obligation. It doesn't mean we have to agree with everything she did, but it's about approaching it with more understanding.
I think one of the things that really hit me was how she talked about dialysis. That pain. She described it as feeling like a sumo wrestler, her body all swollen, no energy. She felt trapped. Like it robbed her of that freedom and that energy that she really valued.
It is a powerful reminder that chronic illness isn't just about the physical symptoms, right? It impacts everything. Mental health, emotional well-being, relationships. Even your sense of self, Shabai's story, really shines a light on the suffering that comes with these conditions, and it's often overlooked.
It makes you think about the limits of medical intervention.
Yeah.
When does prolonging life become more about the technology than the actual quality of life? It's something that we might all have to face at some point, whether it's ourselves or someone we love.
You're right. It's a question we all face. And Shabai's decision, while extreme, it makes us face the realities of chronic illness and those difficult choices. And it challenges us to think about what a good death even means.
Yeah.
It was a concept that we're not very comfortable talking about.
Even with all the controversy around it, I have to admire her courage. It takes a lot of strength to face death on your own terms, to challenge those norms, and to document it all so openly. Even if we don't agree with her choices, there's something powerful about that commitment to living and dying authentically.
I love that. And I think ultimately that's why her story is so fascinating and thought-provoking.
Yeah.
It pushes us to examine our own beliefs,
Yeah.
our fears, our assumptions about life and death, and it encourages us to have these difficult conversations, but with more compassion, more nuance, more respect for the complexity of the human experience.
So where does this leave us? What can our listeners take away from all of this? From this deep dive into Shabai's story and these big questions about life and death and the choices that we make?
I think the biggest takeaway is that there are no easy answers. Shabai's story, it's not a roadmap for how to live or how to die, but it's a starting point for us to look inward, to reflect on our own values, our relationship with mortality, and our own definition of a life well lived. And I think it also challenges us to be more aware of the suffering that people with chronic illnesses experience.
Yeah.
To approach these issues with empathy, with curiosity, and to be willing to have thoughtful and respectful conversations about it all.
I think that's a great point. And maybe the best way to honor Shabai's memory is to keep talking about it.
Yeah.
To move beyond judgment and really explore what it means to live and die authentically and with dignity.
I could agree more. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. What legacy do you want to leave behind? What choices will shape your story? It's a question worth thinking about, not with fear, but with curiosity and an open heart.